Tang Dynasty of the 7th century was a beacon of human civilization. With a population of 1 million, its capital, Chang'an, made the London and Paris of that era look like mere backwater villages. Today, when we think of the Tang, we envision the immortal verses of Li Bai, the ethereal silk robes of the court, and an empire with a heart vast enough to embrace the world. But few dare to speak of the truth that this golden age was built upon the corpses of two brothers whose blood had not yet grown cold. On the morning of the 2nd of July, 626 AD, at the northern entrance of the imperial palace, the Xuanwu Gate, brothers drew swords against brothers in the darkness before dawn. A father was forced to surrender his empire at the point of a spear. This was the most ruthless yet successful coup in Chinese history. Its mastermind, Li Shimin, the man the world would eventually revere as Emperor Taizong, perhaps the greatest monarch to ever sit on the throne. Today, we descend into the shadows of that fateful morning. We must ask a chilling question: if a glorious era must be paid for with the sacrifice of one's own kin, is that price worth paying? To understand the massacre, we must return to the empire's early years. The Tang Dynasty didn't fall from the sky. It was carved out of chaos with blood and steel. But in the distribution of power, the founding emperor, Li Yuan, made a fatal mistake. He named his eldest son, Li Jiancheng, as crown prince to manage the state's bureaucracy. But he gave his second son, Li Shimin, command of the armies to pacify the four corners of the earth. This created a structural deadlock. In the eyes of the soldiers, Li Shimin was their true leader, the invincible Prince of Qin. But by law, the throne belonged to Li Jiancheng, the man sitting in the safety of the capital. As the wars ended, Li Shimin's prestige became too great to ignore. He had crushed every rival. Half of the empire had been conquered by his iron cavalry. The crown prince felt the cold steel of a threat at his neck, while Li Shimin felt the desperation of a man too successful to be allowed to live. At the pinnacle of power, to step back is to fall into an abyss. By the year 626, the struggle reached a boiling point. Records describe a bone-chilling banquet where the crown prince allegedly poisoned Li Shimin's wine. Li Shimin survived, coughing up blood. But the message was clear: this family was no longer large enough for three brothers to coexist. The walls were closing in on Li Shimin. His advisors were exiled, his military powers were stripped. Just days before the coup, the crown prince suggested reassigning Li Shimin's elite generals. It was a death warrant. Once Li Shimin lost his army, he would be a lamb led to the slaughter. This was the darkest hour of his life. He struggled between his father's coldness, his brother's murderous intent, and his subordinates' expectations. Finally, in the dead of night on the 1st of July, he made his choice. Better to strike first than to wait for death. The 2nd of July, 626 AD, 4 a.m., Xuanwu Gate, the jugular vein of the capital. The fog was thick, cloaking the heavy shadow of the gatehouse. Li Shimin had bribed the commander, Chang He, and led 9 elite assassins to lie in wait behind the palace walls. The sound of hooves echoed through the empty stone tunnel. Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji approached. In that instant, the air froze. Li Jiancheng suddenly pulled his reins. He sensed something in the silence, the smell of a trap. He spun his horse around and screamed, "Retreat, back to the East Palace." Discovery meant there was no turning back. Li Shimin galloped out from the shadows, raising the heavy bow that had accompanied him through 100 battles. Aim. Release. The arrow whistled through the air and buried itself in his elder brother's throat. Li Jiancheng slumped from his horse. The legal heir to the Tang Empire was dead, but the nightmare was far from over. Li Shimin chased the younger brother, Li Yuanji, into a dense grove. Then, a freak accident. Li Shimin's robes caught on a low-hanging branch, throwing him from his saddle. The weight of his armor pinned him down. Li Yuanji lunged forward, grabbed the bow, and began to strangle his brother with the string. This was the moment the history of China hung by a thread. The future emperor was seconds from being strangled to death in the dirt. Suddenly, a roar like thunder shook the trees. The legendary general Yu Qijingde charged in like a god of war, scaring off Li Yuanji before piercing him through with a heavy spear. The feud of the brothers was settled inside the gate, but hell was breaking loose outside. 2,000 elite troops of the crown prince were battering the Xuanwu Gate in a vengeful frenzy. At the precipice of defeat, Yuqi Jing did something as brutal as it was effective. He climbed the gatehouse and held up the blood-dripping heads of the two princes. The world went silent, with their leaders dead. For what were they fighting? The 2,000 troops collapsed in terror and vanished into the morning mist. 2 months after the fratricide, Li Shimin ascended the throne. His era was named Zhengguan. What followed was history's most profound irony. This man, whose hands were stained with his brother's blood, would preside over the most enlightened and inclusive era in Chinese history. It was as if he spent the rest of his life governing with a relentless diligence to atone for that bloody morning. He pardoned his brother's advisors, such as the famous Wei Zheng, and invited their harshest criticisms. He lowered taxes, allowed the people to heal, and expanded the empire until he was revered by the nomadic tribes as the Heavenly Khan. He sought to write a chapter so perfect in the history books that the world would forget the screams at Xuanwu Gate. Li Shimin won. He won the throne, and he won history. But in his later years, he remained haunted by the shadows of that gate. He obsessed over the historical records, trying to sanitize the narrative, living his final days in the tension between a thirst for perfection and the fear of his original sin. The Xuanwu Gate Incident remains the ultimate paradox of history, that the bloodiest of crimes could give birth to the most brilliant of civilizations. If history repeated itself, and you were Li Shimin standing at that gate in the dawn, would you remain the prince waiting for execution, or would you fire the arrow that changed the world?